Well, it's sometimes suggested that Enlightenment modernism is the source of these rules. It's my understanding that there is a really positive contribution of the Enlightenment, and that is to observe that language operates according to rules. Okay, not rules of our own making, but rules that have been given to us by the God who invented language.
Greetings. Welcome back to this episode of Theologically Driven. We're continuing our series on hermeneutics today. We talked first about other types of exegesis and the history of hermeneutics, how we've seen a rise in pre-modern exegesis today. Now we're going to take a little bit of time and talk about the historical grammatical method. What is it, and how can we use it and apply it? So I'm joined again by Dr. Snowberger. Thanks for being here.
Good to be here.
So let's talk about the historical grammatical, or we say historical grammatical theological method, but similar things. What do each of those things mean, and what is the method as a whole?
Okay. So when we talk about the historic, we simply mean that we are looking at all of the contexts in which the author wrote, be they historical, grammatical, how words are used at the specific time he is writing, political, cultural, things like that. And it all comes to bear on this question, what could he have meant when he used these words? And having established that, then what specifically did he mean? What do the words mean to him in the moment that he used them? So we can't import our own accumulated ideas and our own culture onto what he has said. We have to think in terms of where he is writing, and specifically, what it means is that we cannot bring later scriptures to bear on earlier scriptures and say that they inform what he meant in those earlier scriptures. So for instance, when Moses says Moses lifts up the serpent in the wilderness, he did not mean to communicate that a crucifixion was about to occur, or it's not a prophecy about a crucifixion. He doesn't even have the category of crucifixion in his head. It hadn't been invented yet. So whatever he meant could not have meant the crucifixion of Jesus Christ.
And that's important because words change meaning over time. How we use a word today, 50 years ago, could have been used to mean something completely different. And we don't want to take our definitions and funnel them back in.
Correct.
So what about that's historical? What about grammatical and then theological?
Okay, so grammatical or syntactical, both of those go together, simply means that we need to know how language works, right? So what do words mean? How do we handle the issue of semantic ranges? How do sentences work? How do you make emphasis? How do we objectively sort out the propositions? How do paragraphs work? Why is that important? How does a whole body of literature work, and the specific kinds of literature in view, the genres, the figures of speech that are being used? When Jesus used a parable, what rules do we use when we read that? What are the different rules that we might use for reading a letter or somebody else's letter, for that matter? How do we read a story? How do we read case law, poetry, and those are the kinds of things we have to bear in mind whenever we read. So that's grammatical. That's and syntactical. But then we also have theological, and this is where sometimes we can get a little bit of tensions going here, right? Some people don't use that word theological in describing the grammatical historical method because of the abuses that have occurred with respect to theological. So I'm not talking here about imposing some sort of ecclesiastical method or body of literature on the Bible and bringing the Bible into conformity with that. That's not what I mean by theological. That's sometimes done in Romanism. It's sometimes done in retrieval theology by imposing the ecumenical creeds on the reading of Scripture and such. Still, we can't attempt to read the Bible. No one does. No one can read the Bible apart from some sort of theological bias. We all do that. So, for instance, if we open up our Bibles and see Hebrews 6, 4-6, and it looks like people can lose their salvation, we don't just let that stand and say, what a mystery. We actually look at the balance of Scripture and say, it can't mean that. So now we're going to explore other possibilities of what those words might mean.
Right, because we have clear texts that inform the more difficult texts, and we can build a theological system that way. And then Scripture can't contradict itself.
Correct. Yeah. And even though the Bible does come to us in a sequence, right, a historical sequence, the finished product does stand for us as something of a single, consistent, coherent whole. And so we can bring to bear the conclusions derived elsewhere in Scripture, even later Scriptures, because there's going to be coherence. If a later Scripture says something other than my conclusion here, then perhaps I need to go back and see where I've read things wrong. So it's not as though theology has no bearing, or even later Scriptures have no bearing at all on the reading of a specific text. But we have to bear in mind always that we need to read them within their historical context.
Yeah, that's good. So where are we getting these rules from? Are we just making them up? What's the authorial basis for this system?
Well, it's sometimes suggested that Enlightenment modernism is the source of these rules, and some go so far as to say that that's the undoing of Christian hermeneutics and the rise of humanistic sorts of hermeneutics. And there's no doubt that the Enlightenment did add a lot of objectivity to a hermeneutical approach in the medieval period that was very subjective. Okay, but it's not as though the grammatical historical method that emerged is a strict product of Occam's razor. I mean, that's I think that's an overstatement of what's going on. It's my understanding that there is a really positive contribution of the Enlightenment, and that is to observe that language operates according to rules. Okay, not rules of our own making, but rules that have been given to us by the God who invented language. Okay, and so it's not as though our whims lie at the center of how we read the Bible, but really it's the transcendent quality of these rules that lend them their authority. So when we talk about transcendent laws, we're talking about laws by which the language we use actually can work. Okay, so we're using rules of language when we talk, and so Fee and Stewart, of course, are pretty famous for identifying two of these rules. You know, a text can never mean what it never meant is number one, and then the author establishes meaning. Okay, and those are sort of their go-to rules for reading the Bible. Okay, and so why do those work? They're great. We know they're true because we use them continuously. And the fact is, if we were not assuming those rules as we talk to each other right now, our communication would fall flat. We could not communicate apart from those rules. Now, Dr. McCune a few years ago detailed what he saw as the received laws of language. He expanded them into four. And I think this is one of his greatest contributions here to the discussion. How does language work? And he came up with four transcendent laws of language that seem to work very well. I've been very pleased with those.
So what are those four?
Okay, number one is the univocal nature of language. Okay, so speakers always use one voice. Okay, that's probably more specifically, they always speak with distinct intent. I mean, it's possible they can mean more than one thing. I mean, there are figures of speech that have double meaning, but they always speak with distinct and defined intent. And so it means that readers cannot assign, after the fact, arcane or occult meanings to the text that the author never intended. So that's number one. So the univocal nature of language. Second is the jurisdiction of authorial intent, which is Fee and Stewart's rule there. The author is the one who assigns meaning. And again, it's not to say that there is no range of meanings, but we're suggesting that the author alone is the arbiter of his specific intent. And so the reader is not tasked with assigning intent, but discovering it. Okay, so the jurisdiction of authorial intent. Third, the unitary authorship of Scripture. And this was more narrowly assigned to the Bible, but even though there are two distinct authors at any given point in the writing of Scripture, there's a human author and a divine author, they always speak with one voice. I've come to really appreciate John Frame's definition of inerrancy. It is a creation of identity between the words of the human and the divine authors, and I think he's exactly right. Okay, that's what inerrancy, that's what inspiration does. That's what inerrancy does for us. There is a single meaning, even though there's two people speaking. There's a single meaning. Of course, God always knows more implications of what is being said than the human author does, but implications are not meaning. Meaning is singular. The implications are always multiplied. And then finally is the textually based locus of meaning, which he means that in order to get to the mind of the author, the principal way we find his mind is through his words. Now, as we're going to see a little bit later in this discussion here, there is a sense in which we can think a little bit more broadly because we have a canon and we have that author's other materials, so we can find his mind a little bit more in some of his other writings and some of the rest of the writings of Scripture, but it's very narrowly defined here. The words are where we find the meaning, not in some sort of abstract intention that he doesn't spell out.
Right. Yeah, the meaning doesn't come to us apart from the words in new revelation. And then I think this is actually a really good point to to make for people who are studying the Bible. If you want to know the meaning, then read it. Right. You don't have to look to other things to find the meaning. The meaning is there in the text, in the words. So read the Bible, read the words. What about levels of meaning? This will come up often. We just talked about the identity created within the word, but then some people will say, well, there's different levels and there could be like a physical meaning and a spiritual. What would you say that?
Right. Yeah. It's always true that there is a multiplicity of significance and implications of any given statement, okay? But that's not the same thing as saying that there are multiple senses or multiple meanings. So we're aware that the Alexandrian school and the patristic model involved 4 senses of Scripture. Not every Scripture had all 4 senses, but potentially could have up to 4 senses. The first of which was the literal, what the author actually said. The second one would be the allegorical sense, which is a symbolic or figurative meaning, where there can be assignments of words and persons to have additional meanings, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes connected with Jesus, right? So that's the way they would connect with the gospel. Then there was the tropological or moral reading, so that's ethics applied to daily life and conduct. And then the anagogical, which is the sort of the most far out. In fact, the word anagao is Greek for to ascend. This would be a sense that would be available only to those Gnostics who have ascended into this deeper knowledge. So that would be the mystical sense. Now, in practice, those weren't always used with equal illegitimacy. I mean, oftentimes it would be just a matter of saying, okay, this is the ethical import of what is here, and I have no problem with that. But we're not talking about a separate sense. Okay, so Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness. We talked about that one just a little bit ago. He wasn't talking about the crucifixion. We said that. Paul actually says, what is he doing? He's telling a story about what happened. Tells us something about God's character, tells us something about his ethical expectation, justification, satisfaction of God's justice, and such. Paul comes along in 1 Corinthians 10 and gives us some ethical implications, right? He says these things, and He actually lists this story among these things. These things are written for us upon whom the ends of the ages have come, so that you might, in this case, learn not to complain. Okay, so it's a very ethical explanation here. Of course, we're very well aware of the fact that Jesus used this story as well in John chapter 3 to point to the cross, right? So he says, just as Moses was the snake was lifted up in the wilderness, so also must the Son of Man be lifted up. And so he uses in an analogical sense. He makes an analogy, just like, so also. But neither one of these, even though they are giving an ethical implication or an analogical implication, neither one is supplying a new meaning. Okay, and that's to me what we have to protect.
Yeah, we can't add to what the author did not intend. Some people will argue that once an author writes, the words then solidify that meaning, and they don't want to root it back to authorial intent. It's now just the words and the meaning of those words. How would you answer that, or what were your thoughts on that?
Okay, so now you're getting into a sort of a tricky technical area here. So I have migrated in my thinking to using the word originalist rather than literal, because I think it does help a little bit with understanding, but it also creates something of a tension as well. Okay, so if you followed at all the debate and discussion of originalism in the literature, you'll know that Scalia and Alito and others who self-style themselves as originalists have abandoned the phrase authorial intent. They've migrated to the idea of original public meaning. Okay, so that's the preferred phrase that they use. And the point here is that when you have a piece of legal document, the Constitution, or some piece of case law, there is no other window into the original author's mind other than his words. Okay, and that is because that person is writing very narrowly. Okay, we don't have a canon with which we can compare it to, and we can't even trust other things that person has written because he's not inerrant. He might have made mistakes. He might have been self-contradictory along the way. All we have are the words that he wrote in this specific context, and if we exceed those words, why then we've given into what they call purposivism. Okay, so where I get to decide, okay, if that author were here today, what would he be saying, or extrapolating what he might now say about this situation if he were here, which he's not. But for Alito, Scalia, you can never do that, and I appreciate that because that brings the reader into the interpretation of what's going on. But in the Bible, that idea of original public meaning is, I think, a little bit too narrow because we do have the rest of that author's writings, and they are coherent, and they are inerrant, and they sit within a body of a canon of literature that is likewise coherent, consistent with itself. And so if there is some sort of a question as to what a given verse means, we can look to see what else that author has said and what the whole canon has said in order to at least inform us to some degree as to what the meaning is.
Yeah. Now, you suggested, I think in a journal article, that you liked the word originalism.
Yeah.
You thought so, but you are not meaning, when applying that to biblical hermeneutics, all that they mean.
Correct. When
they're talking about case law and that sort of thing.
Yeah, if we mean by literal, wooden, or not recognizing any genres or any figures of speech, then I don't want to be that kind of a literal.
Yeah,
It's
too literal.
You can be too literal, yes, if that's what you mean by it. But if you mean by literal the quest for the fixed and singular intention of the original author, we can never be too literal. I mean, that's exactly what we're looking for. And again, in recent days, I've migrated to the idea of originalism because I think more people have a positive and careful understanding of that word than they do of literal. It's still got its tensions. We've just walked through a few of them, but I think perhaps it pushes us towards this idea of original authorial intent as found in the words that they used.
Yeah. And the important thing is to remember when we're studying the Bible, we are on a quest for discovery. We are trying to find this is the meaning that is there. We don't add meaning to it. So that's great. Thank you, Dr. Snowberger, for coming on the podcast today. And thank you for listening to Theologically Driven. We're a podcast of Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary. If you'd like to learn more about our seminary, just go to dbts.edu.